Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm Heather Bernt-Santy, and the nerd co-host is Lizz Nolasco. Hi, Liz.
Hello.
And our guest today is Alex Winninghoff, who wrote an article that we're going to discuss. The article is called Trauma by Numbers, Warnings Against the Use of ACE Scores in Trauma-Informed Schools. And I think this is going to be a surprise for a lot of listeners. But Alex, what do you want folks to know about you before we jump into the article?
Sure. My name's Alex, and I am a researcher and also an instructional coach at a comprehensive high school. I'm finishing my dissertation work, which is a pretty comprehensive look at the history of the ACE public health campaign and ACE screening.
All right. I was definitely surprised when I read this article with different ways of thinking. Also, a lot of times just around trauma in general, I have kind of instincts that I can't quite define or articulate. And then I read something and I'm like, yes, that's what I was. So there were a couple of spots in here that happened for me. So again, the article is called Trauma by Numbers, Warning Against the Use of ACE Scores in Trauma-Informed Schools. And it's open access on Bank Street College. They have an occasional paper series that this comes from. So we're going to start with this quote from the article. ACE and TI, trauma-informed frameworks, often seem to validate the struggles that many teachers witness in the lives of their students. There are elements that can hardly be argued with. TI frameworks recognize that students face significant hardships during childhood. They institutionally validate kindness, compassion, and flexible responses to student behaviors. They also establish a unifying message of hope and offer strategies to building student resilience, in quotes. These elements appear positive and aligned with social justice goals and ideologies, but there are also elements of TI frameworks that warrant critical consideration. There are, for instance, ethical concerns relating to requests for ACE disclosures from students, developing school ACE screening practices, or attaching individual ACE scores that have been reported to schools from an outside agency or clinic. So maybe first we need to define ACEs.
Sure.
Before we go forward, and then we can jump into what some of those that critical consideration might be.
Okay, so stop me if I go on, because actually ACEs is a very difficult concept to summarize, which is part of the critique that is coming up for scholars internationally about the use of ACEs. So we'll start off by saying that the concept of adverse childhood experiences was leveraged in research prior to its adoption by the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, beginning in 1991 with the first meeting between the two primary investigators of the study, Robert Anda and Vincent Folletti. And the process of designing the ACE study occurred between 1991 to 93. Ultimately, the study was conducted between 96 and 97, or there were two waves prior to that, and the first study was published in 1998. So in the first study, eight categories of adversity were selected, but 7 were published for the first publication. And then after the second wave, the 10 ACE categories were selected, and those are what we commonly understand to be the ACEs and the ACE score of 0 through 10. So ACEs are typically categories of abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction is the term that was used before. So the concept of family dysfunction is a broad territory and has been contested and reframed since publication of the ACE study between 1998 and 2014. The original investigators of the study published over 80 papers on ACEs, each paper centering around some territory of adversity and a correlation to biological, psychological, social, or cognitive dysfunction or deficiency. And from there, it also became this category that gained a lot of interest for policymakers, for researchers across disciplines. And ultimately, we see that it came into education approximately around 2009 in the territory of research. And those of us who've been in any professional development for education over the last couple of decades are likely to have encountered ACEs in trauma-informed professional development, or through research, or through screening practices. And so it's become a pretty pervasive paradigm in education, but across discourses, and entered into public health, into welfare, into education, into clinical practices. And so it really has traveled from the territory of theory to practice across institutions and across discourses.
Yeah. I right now I am a college instructor, early childhood program chair at a community college, and I'm writing a new course that we just invented about supportive interactions and guiding behavior, but trauma is a big piece of it. So ACEs ACE scores are gonna be in there somewhere. And so I was reflecting on how I've personally experienced it. And it's mostly when I was a child care center director, it was kind of just trickling into the early childhood world, it seems like. It was mostly families, like maybe foster families were coming in and talking to me about ACE scores and their child's ACE scores. And that's when I first started to get familiar with it, learn about it a little bit. But I want to ask Lizz what her experiences or thoughts have been around if we don't intentionally make time for Lizz, she's too polite to butt in. So I have to give her
Get on
turn
in, Lizz.
explicitly.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly become familiar, or I became familiar with trauma-informed schools probably about 10 years ago. And I know, one of the big keynotes at the state conference for the IAUIC a while back was specifically relating to trauma. And I think while I was reading this, it kind of brought me back to one of my first interactions with a new teacher who was really just learning about these things for the first time. And she came back to me from the conference. It was the first time she'd attended, and she was talking about all this stuff. And then she started like name names. She's like, well, I need to talk to these parents to find out if these kids have experienced trauma. And I said, nope, we can just assume they have, or we can just respect them as people.
Yeah, so it sounds like you have an instinct right away that this isn't necessarily information that we need to go seeking out, that we can apply what Alex Bennett, who is also a researcher in this field of equity and trauma-informed practice, suggested that we apply a universal model. And that's kind of one of our ways of thinking about trauma. That, what you might have noticed from my critique in the article is that one of my concerns is that there are more than 10 categories of childhood experiences that affect us throughout our life. And what is most significantly absent, and what really hasn't aged well with the ACE study, is the lack of attention to the systemic factors that disproportionately create trauma in people's lives. And some of that is, of course, racial trauma, and the traumas that come with being minoritized in society, and that come from lack of resources. And when we think about trauma, we need to think about it in a way that is far more complex than what exists alone in household environments. There's a tendency, there's a common narrative in education to think that students are coming to school struggling because they're from those houses, from there's something going on in their family. There's a
that
struggle
phrase.
Yeah. Well, we don't know what their family life
I
is
wonder
like.
if there's something going on at home.
Yeah. We constantly go to that narrative. And it's a narrative that lets educators and systems in their totality kind of off the hook.
Yeah.
If we're situated as this outside entity, something that we're not responsible for perpetuating, not only does it let us off that off the hook, but it also situates us in a savior pose,
Yeah.
where,
Yeah.
and so I think that if there's a message about the problem of ACEs, one of those key messages is that the categories themselves are extremely limited. Within those categories, there's quite a lot of variation that's substantial. There's a big difference between parents being divorced and experiencing, more than a decade of ongoing pervasive abuse.
Right. And I was looking at the list last night to see what my score would be. And I hit about a 7 for my total life, but like my parents got divorced when I was 10, but it was it was a good thing for a while. Like, you know what I mean? Like divorce doesn't always mean trauma. That was one of the things that came to mind for me, thinking about each of these categories could be so many different things. And
Yeah.
we've tried to oversimplify it so that it's easily measurable.
Yeah, and simple answers are great because they make us believe that there's simple solutions.
Uh-huh.
A lot of people, and myself included, when I first encountered the ACE study, I was a teacher at the time. I was a first-year teacher. Like everybody who encounters the ACE, paradigm, you're looking at it and trying to calculate your ACE score first. That's just our nature, and I remember, finding out about the ACE study, thinking about students that I had, and just like that section that you read, there's that sense that, oh, Eureka, we have found the answer, but what is missing oftentimes in this field of ACE-based trauma-informed practice is that we don't move past screening. What is the next step? Where are the suggestions for what we do institutionally? And oftentimes those answers are building resilience and operating with kindness and flexibility. These, to me, as an educator, are best practices.
Right. Things we should be doing anyway. Yes.
As a human being.
Yeah. And that's Liz,
human
that's
being practices.
Kind of what you were saying when you were like, we just treat them as if we just kind of assume that it's there and put that into practice, right?
Right. And we can't allow this idea of building resilience to be one directional. Like we pour in resilience to them, we give them resilience, and then if they don't take it, then that's on the ACEs. That's their stuff.
Yes. And then what does that say in terms of developing a narrative that borders on determinism? Okay, because historically we can point to these master concepts, these master pathologies that have been used and weaponized through policy, through institutions to screen and identify people who are regarded as on a trajectory to be biologically, psychologically, socially, cognitively less fit. Okay, and when we put that in a territory of documenting through screening, whether it be through schools, through medical records, what we're doing is we're stamping on a record a probabilistic model that puts us on a trajectory toward identifying people as risky. And what that risk is situated in is not just a risk that this student won't learn. Okay, in a healthcare setting, this is a person who is considered to be risky. What does that mean for insurance companies, for instance, to have a high ACE score? If police have access to an ACE score, and we know that ACEs are associated with greater likelihood of criminality, delinquency, antisocial behavior, how is a police officer going to interpret an ACE score? Or how could having that score on records identify somebody as a threat to others? So when we think about public health, we're thinking not just about individual human beings and what we can identify about them based on the score. We're thinking about how ACEs is becoming this kind of territory of identifying a section of the population on a spectrum of relative biological, psychological, social, and cognitive deficiency. And though it's not technically deterministic, it does border very closely with the kind of backdoor out being resilience, and probability. That's what saves ACE discourse from being firmly deterministic. But there have been internationally and in the United States several scholars who have focused on that proximity to determinism and leveraged critiques against the methodological and conceptual problems with the ACE paradigm for those reasons.
So I've been making notes while I'm listening of things I want you to go back and talk a little bit more in depth about. But before I do that, Liz, do you have any question or any comment in here before we?
Oh, I was just going to say that I think there's also, alongside that determinism, there's this idea of pity that can go along with educators knowing a child's ACE score, right? Or having that idea of what it kind of ties into that savior complex that you were talking about, right? But this idea of just, oh, yeah, you don't know any better, or, you can't do any better, which just is, I think it's so detrimental to humanizing people and their whole life experiences when you have this number and you say, oh, and you kind of take this view, this approach with them of pity rather than support, and treating them with basic human kindness and dignity.
I think about that a lot too, in terms of educators having access to that score and possibly thinking, oh, well, this student has reading difficulties or math difficulties or so many struggles at home that, that's my way of making sense that they're not going to have access to this curriculum. So that's part of that idea of, what is the responsibility of educators? Well, we work to educate everybody. We work to open possibilities for everybody. And when we think that there's a problem outside that we have no control over, that causes this student before us to have so many cognitive complexities based on a single signifier of an ACE score, that is a way that we can identify the problem as out of our control and therefore not our responsibility to address.
That was one of the things I was going to ask you to talk more about, was we talked about that there must be something going on at home bit and how that's sort of problematic. And I wanted to come back to why could that be a problem? And you just sort of hit on that, both of you, with it. Well, then it's something outside of my control. This is happening at home. And if the parents won't change, there's nothing I can do about this problem. And whether it's a conscious decision or not, we do sort of release ourselves from the responsibility.
And walk into any American school. I'm going to, after I talk to the school that I work in. And I talk to students every day. And we know that trauma is absolutely going on in our schools. We would like to believe that it's not, and we'd like to have an image of schools as being these always safe spaces for students, that that we protect students. But when we step back and we look at the school system that we're in, we know that schools are sites of bullying. We know that teachers may come into this profession prepared to do their best, but there are a number of ideological and political differences that play out. We know that can be a source of trauma. We know that racism exists in our schools deeply at the level of the curriculum, at the level of interaction, at the level of systems and barriers that are created that students interact with, and that is an ongoing trauma. We know that schools are sites of school shootings. We know that police officers exist in our schools, and that can be a source of triggers and trauma for students. And so, as much as we would like to imagine that schools are going to be these healing-centered places, we have a great deal of work to do before we can say that schools are just not traumatizing. And by putting teachers in a position where they would request information about a student through screening practices, that really runs counter to clinical guidelines for supporting and addressing trauma. For anybody who's been in a therapeutic environment and come to a therapist with their own experiences of trauma, that isn't usually an introduction conversation, right? That takes time to build trust. and to feel connected. And so the capacity to take that away from trauma survivors, you know, to assume that you can cross that boundary with people who've been traumatized. That can be a reenactment of trauma, to take away someone's right to their privacy, you know, to take away their right to disclose on their own terms with the people that they identify as safe. So
Yeah. Pause. This is a Liz pause.
No, sorry.
Okay.
Processing.
Yeah, no, so you went much more in depth than this is going to sort of sound maybe oversimplified, and probably I'm going to get some criticism for this from folks who are listening, but as I've been reading about trauma and trauma-informed, trauma responsive practices, and thinking about ACE scores now, I have never seen anything that says this could also be happening with teachers. But I know that I have been in early childhood programs, and there has been verbal abuse, there has been emotional abuse, there's been toxic stress kinds of situations, but there's nothing that I've read so far that says it's always at home and families or parents. There's nothing about how this could be happening in our programs.
There are outstanding researchers who I'm very fortunate to be in a research community with, who have talked about some of those elements of the trauma-informed movement. And I want to hold up Simona Golden and Addison Duane in particular, who are two fantastic researchers, also Alex Winninghoff, who I mentioned earlier. But they are doing work and have been doing work on the need to recognize that trauma is very much a pervasive force within our schools, perpetuated in schools. And we have to understand that trauma isn't something that is always intended, but it's a reality that is pervasive, and there's quite a lot that we don't see as educators that happens within our schools. And then when you scale out and you look at the broader social and systemic factors, then we certainly need to understand that it's pervasive. And so I would really suggest that your listeners, viewers, would take a look at some of the research from Simona Golden, Addison Duane, and some other folks who I've got a very long list of, would be happy to send along some links.
We can include that kind of stuff in the episode description and stuff if you want to share.
I feel like this is certainly a growing community of researchers who are looking at the need for equity-centered trauma-informed practices, looking at systemic trauma-informed practices, and challenging the limitations of situating trauma as some outside factor that's out of our control, because it's very much in our control what we do at the systems level and in our practice in addressing the ways that trauma works within the context of school communities.
So one of the other things that I wanted to go back to a little bit, and it's come up a couple times now, is the savior pose or the savior complex. And there's one part of the article where you talk about this discussion of ACE scores being value laden. And I think that so why? Because I think most people who go into education, early childhood, elementary, whatever level, are like doing it because they they want to save children, essentially. They want to, we go, like I've said many times, I went into this so that I could be what I didn't have, and so there's a value, I think, in that, but it can also become really problematic. And
absolutely.
And that's what I thought about as I read parts of this, where you talk about the value laden piece.
Sure. I mean, it's a really uncomfortable conversation that educators, and particularly white educators, need to have with themselves about what their intention is for engaging in this work. This is a profession that requires a broad skill set, and it requires that you intentionally reflect and put your ego aside in this work. And when you're taking a savior pose, which is, one of those narrative that really, is locked into a lot of education, um, and what that does is it's a way of extending these patterns of thinking and these practices that situate, your role in a position of superiority, and also come from an orientation of believing that children need to be saved
Mhm.
from their families. And that really is counter to working with families. And it has a very long history, and we need to regard ourselves as being partners with families, and partners with our communities. And when we look at something like the ACE score, which really reinvigorates some of those narratives, we need to think more critically. For instance, let's take a look at one of the ACE scores, about having, or one of the ACE categories about having a family member who has been, in some cases, it's framed as been imprisoned or incarcerated. In other publications, you'll see that it's reflected as has engaged in criminal behavior. There's flexibility in that. You know, consider who in our country is targeted by policing.
Mhm.
Consider the injustices of our justice system and why it is that those disproportionalities exist in, for instance, Black and Latino, Latinx communities, impoverished communities. What does that say about systemic harm? The idea that we would stop at, um, putting our orientation toward, if somebody in your family is incarcerated, then that is an individual problem, when we know absolutely that this is a much broader conversation and a much bigger systemic issue that we're encountering. So those are just one of the ways that the ACE score creates disproportionalities that, is assumed to be familial based, but is certainly, a much broader scope issue.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
thought that was just the scope of this. I found when you cited one of the critiques about the absence of poverty in the ACE framework doesn't stem from neutral scientific calculation or accidental omission. Um, I mean, what an absolutely wild decision to make.
And we definitely should recognize that impoverishment itself is not always an experience of trauma, nor is parental divorce, nor are some of the complexities and the layers of ACEs.
Right.
But we should pay attention to why it is some categories were framed and why some categories aren't, and why it might be beneficial to situate risks in a behavioral analysis. That's been a long-standing paradigm of the public health movement, arguably before the 1970s, but certainly in the mid 1970s, the paradigm of prevention and wellness promotion took off, and this has been it's been called an evolution of that public health movement to further situate risk and negative health outcomes as a matter of behaviors, as a
Mhm.
matter of the environment that you're in, instead of scaling out and looking at the social and systemic factors that create hierarchies in our uh, in our health system.
Mhm.
Another way that we could think about risk factors is in access to healthcare, or racial health disparities, or in access to healthy foods, in access to healthy environments. There are other ways that negative health outcomes are distributed, across our population in ways that, harm people, but situating it as a matter of family origin and family exposure alone is a long-standing tradition of public health, and not one with a positive history.
Mhm. There's a story that you tell in the article of I can't find where the origin was, so you might have to help me, but it's a teacher, like a high school teacher, showing PET scan results
Yeah, that
of
was at
what your
Lincoln.
brain looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that on more than a few occasions, but that
Mhm.
was presented in the documentary Paper Tigers, which was filmed in Washington State. I think it was in 2006.
Uh-huh.
And no doubt that was a well-intentioned
Mhm.
teacher.
Yeah,
You know,
comparing the healthy quote unquote brain to
yeah,
the abused brain. And then
yeah,
he ends it his conversation with the students with essentially, what are you going to do to change this? What are you going to do to break the cycle? And that comes to mind when you're talking about how we need to have a systemic view
yeah,
of some of this. Like he left those students feeling like, I feel like, if you don't know how to break the cycle, then something continues to be wrong with you,
yeah.
instead of
I
a review of
mean,
what's causing these adverse experiences.
absolutely. Yeah, it's not a deep analysis of the ways that our social systems and structures are placing students in that particular classroom at harm and
Mhm.
creating inequalities that are no doubt generations deep.
Mhm.
You know, the inequalities that might be generations deep are erased from that conversation, and what comes to the surface is only individual choices. It's part of this rugged individualist kind of neoliberal
Mhm.
narrative, um,
Mhm.
that all outcomes are the choice of the individual and the product of individual actors. And you know, that message of supposed hope isn't very hopeful, and hope alone
Yeah.
doesn't doesn't do much in terms of material outcomes. And so, and it also, there's a message of turning students against their families, you know.
Yeah.
And those particular brain scans are of a Romanian orphan, and those have been weaponized
Mhm.
in numerous
Yeah.
many ways in presenting this research, because it'll immediately grab your attention,
And
but
hook your emotion.
yeah,
You
it
know, it's we've already sort of lost control of our frontal lobe just because we see those very graphic brain scans. Um,
yeah,
And
it
I
has
wonder
a
what seeing that does in terms of the student's feeling of their locus of control, right? Obviously, we're
mm,
saying there are massive systemic barriers, there are massive systemic issues that have led to a number of these negative experiences, these traumas. But I mean, sitting there looking at this, you can see a kid thinking, well, that's it. I'm broken and there's no hope for me, you know, and no amount of pouring in resilience and whatever else we're trying to give them in terms of what they can do to change this is going to alter that image of themselves now as just
mhm.
permanently, you know, unfixable.
Yeah.
yeah, and you know, to what extent does that become a self-perpetuating story? You know, to what extent might a young person encounter an ACE score, and why wouldn't that lesson stand out for you
Mhm.
and carry some weight? And what might you project into your future, and how might you situate that on this very brief notion outside of a broader context, you know, that says this is the likely end for you. You
Mhm.
know, you're likely to encounter all these health problems. You're likely to be a criminal. I mean, the list is expansive
Mhm.
of correlations between ACEs and negative outcomes. If you give
Mhm.
me a negative outcome, I can likely find you a body of research that cites ACEs as being a root origin of that problem.
Mhm.
And so it's a powerful paradigm, and has massive potential to be weaponized and is being weaponized in a
Mhm.
number of ways. But when we think about that on the individual level, what is the effect on an individual person? Um, yeah, it can be a narrative that becomes self-perpetuating.
Mhm. Excuse me. Um, oh, I just lost my thought.
It's all right.
It's gone. It's
That's okay.
gone.
Fine.
So
Fine.
you've used the word weaponized several times. Will you talk a little bit about what you mean when you talk about this idea being weaponized, or this process?
Mhm. Yeah. So again, I'd like to say that there are scholars out there who, in the same issue that I was published in for this, Simona Golden wrote a paper about the weaponization of the trauma-informed movement, and I'd like to point readers toward that for sure. But what we're thinking about when we're talking about this idea of weaponizing ACE scores, part of it happens in terms of those dynamics between teachers in classrooms, just having access to that ACE score. We know that that allows us to tell a story that, well, this student who I maybe haven't even met yet, coming into my classroom, is likely to have a number of behavioral problems, is likely to have mental health problems, is likely to have learning problems, literacy problems, all kinds of cognitive issues. If we presuppose any story about a student, then that's oftentimes the story that we see. And if we see that story, we're engaging in a dynamic where we're potentially reinforcing those ideas for ourselves, for that student. And so that's a form of weaponization. But then when we scale out and we think about the ways that just asking someone, just becoming a system, as educators who feel entitled to expand our jurisdiction into the homes and lives of families. And we're entitled to ask about the very intimate details of people's lives, whether they're present or past, whether or not we have a relationship for them or with them, whether or not we have material solutions, or whether or not we're going to engage in ongoing support. That's a level of weaponization, to weaponize the relationship that teachers need to build in order for that relationship to be pedagogical. That's a way of creating damage in that relationship. If we just assume that we're entitled and we haven't created trust, and it expands our role, and it shifts or complicates those boundaries. Schools have long policed families, and particularly Black families. And, we need to be cognizant of the ethical issues that come with collecting data on families, and what the nature of our role is, and how we should expand that. So that's a piece of it. And then ACE scores as a way of identifying pre-criminality, or pre-delinquency, or any number of problems, using ACE scores to predict risk behaviors and the potentials of that for insurance companies. You should know that nobody's more excited about ACE scores and collecting ACE data than every major insurance company. And the fact that the first ACE study was conducted by Kaiser Permanente Health Appraisals should, we should be aware of why that would be interesting data, and why it would be necessary to frame ACEs as being entirely a matter of individual circumstances and environments.
That hadn't even occurred to me, the insurance side, the health side, until I was reading this and thinking about what you've shared here in the article.
So, I think it's also really important for us to understand. Sorry about all these rainbows everywhere.
They're in
Please don't apologize for rainbows.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a rainbow friendly
my cat was
show.
over here. Yeah. Okay, good. Rainbow friendly household. So, we need to understand that ACEs does not have to be firmly deterministic to operate as though it potentially is. We can't really measure resilience. There are scholars who have tried to create resilience indicators. The idea of resilience is a soft concept that we don't firmly have an idea of what that means or how that's actualized. There have been instances where, Dr. Vincent Folletti, one of the primary architects of the ACE study, has referenced people who are highly successful in their lives and who had high ACE scores and who he recognizes as still not being resilient, because it affected their lives, that they had these histories of abuse. So what resilience is and how we can measure it and how we distinguish who is resilient enough, we don't really have a measure for that. And as much as ACEs may not be constructed as entirely deterministic, the ACE score is static. If it's on your records,
Oh, sure.
it is static. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter how resilient you are, it does not erase what your records say your
Yeah.
ACE score is. And so it creates its own sort of determinism, and it's a social health determinant, and it's recorded as such. So that's a whole other
Right. I think
long
resilience has become another buzzword in early childhood and in education in general, but the idea being sort of, nobody's saying this part out loud necessarily, but we can do whatever we want because children are resilient. We don't have to look for solutions because we can just put this on the shoulders of children and their resilience will bring them through whatever garbage we've created for them.
Yeah, it's a feel-good word.
Yeah.
But what it actually means is subject to a whole lot of interpretation. And it doesn't point us toward our own responsibility to address the conditions that students and young people need to be resilient against. It just presumes that there's this catastrophe that we all are constantly recovering from and can bounce back from. But it's certainly an inadequate concept, and also demands equal critical attention. So
I think it's so interesting, that range of so-called negative outcomes. I mean, it kind of, you have to ask what makes something a negative outcome. I mean, obviously, criminality, antisocial traits, those are not ideal, right? But if we're looking at a broader society, is an individual's quote unquote school failure if they're still able to build a happy life, if they're still able to, find meaning?
how many
How is
adults
that a
do you know in
failure?
your life who have no negative outcomes? This idea of negative outcomes, I think in general, we need to pay attention to these very broad concepts. We can agree that things that are negative are bad. Okay. Things that are negative are bad, right? And when we just are able to say, like, this idea, this concept of ACEs, which is, by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, 10 categories of abuse, dysfunction, and neglect. But more broadly, the research shows that the ACE signifier has changed dramatically and has been taken up and reformed by researchers, expanded. In some instances, impoverishment is included, or poverty is included. In some instances, there are pieces that are taken out or argued against. And if ACEs can mean everything, what does it mean? What is that container? And if we can just take things out and put new things in, it challenges the validity of the concept. And there have been researchers internationally. This is an international critique. It's an international movement. It's been taken up by the World Health Organization. The ACE IQ, the ACE International Questionnaire, is used by researchers across nations. And so it's been a site of international critique, and one researcher in particular, or a group of researchers in the United Kingdom, Susan White and Rosalind Edwards, and Val Giles, wrote a paper about ACEs being a chaotic concept, and argued from a position of the social sciences that there are methodological and conceptual problems with the ACE paradigm. And so it's easy for us to say it's science. Well, we understand that science is, this is not just a matter of blood, checking blood pressure. This is a concept that is malleable, flexible, soft around the edges, changes, expands, shrinks. And so it isn't an exact, precise framework that we can point to and say that we've arrived on precisely what ACEs are.
Yeah.
And when something has that much power to be weaponized and isn't conceptually clear, it demands a high degree of critique and awareness and attention to the ethics of how it's being used.
Yeah. I thought Liz was going to say something. So I'm going to ask you now, Liz, are there things in the article that you wanted to bring in that we haven't touched on yet?
I think, I guess what really stood out to me, in addition to all of the other 100 incredible,
I know there was a lot of highlighting in this one
about, right? Just the idea of how we respond, how we create these, so-called trauma-informed schools, right? And how they're there's a lot of really fuzzy research on that. So my thesis was in social and emotional learning, and I looked a lot at building compassion in schools, right? And so I was looking at all these different published curricula and all the really bad research used to validate them.
Oh boy.
And I think we can't ignore that if we're talking about trying to use these, so-called research-based best practices that aren't valid, that are bad research, that are cherry-picked and just wildly inadequate for all children. And if we're knowing that these children, there are a subset of children who are experiencing ongoing traumas, it just continues to build that inequity, right? Because there are children who are doing so great at the kindness curriculum, and then there are those kids who just aren't. And when kindness and compassion and citizenship become test scores,
absolutely,
we're really good at commodifying. If it can be sold, we want to sell it, and we're going to figure out a way to sell this this idea or this buzzword for sure.
And that word commodity is really important when we're thinking about ACEs. SEL has expanded, and to some degree, necessarily we need to find ways to address the multitude of problems and crises that our students and the families that we work with in our communities are faced with, and that's a legitimate response. But when we bring it down to the level of standardized numbers and standardized curriculum and see schools as places that should police behaviors and produce a certain kind of student who will respond to life in a certain kind of way and have a certain set of morals, then we need to be attentive to the ways that that is potentially overreaching. Do we set the moral bar? Do we establish the moral frameworks for our society? Is there any way that that can be culturally responsive? Those are some of the big questions that folks in the world of social emotional learning research are wrestling with. And I'd also like to point out that while Vincent Folletti, one of the original investigators, is still very much an advocate for ACE screening, Robert Anda, the other primary investigator, has come out and written a paper, not with Vincent Folletti's name on it, he argues against ACE screening and has explained that its use as an epidemiological tool was not intended to be scaled down to the individual level, and it doesn't reflect likely individual outcomes. That's not what epidemiological tools are built for. And so as much as he had used ACE screenings and been an ACE screening advocate for much of his career, in 2020, he did publish a paper with two of his long-standing research partners advocating against it, and I'd be happy to link that article. There's also an excellent presentation that's available on YouTube from Robert Anda explaining why ACEs can be taken up as he uses the phrase accrued measure of trauma. And
Okay.
that's also reflected in his paper. So even at the level of those who the concept originated from, there's some backpedaling or some restatement of the purpose of ACE that
Okay.
Do you
is
think
very
then that
much
there,
reflecting on.
sorry, do you think then that there could be a use for aggregate ACE data from a school district or from regions? Do you think that that is something that might be useful, or do you think it really just comes back to that idea of best practices in teaching are being flexible, being compassionate, being
I mean,
reasonable?
what would that information give us? And what would we do with that information? Why is that necessary for us to have that information? And what other information or stories are we shutting down by making a decision about exactly what categories of exposures we are prioritizing, you know? And so I would say I'm not a fan of the use of ACE score data or the collection of ACE score data or the use of ACE score data, certainly at the school level. I don't believe that that is the way that we should be marking or measuring or identifying or conceptualizing trauma. There's no doubt that those ACE categories can be experiences that lead to trauma, but it's really important to understand the difference between a experience that may lead to trauma and the experience of trauma. So the category from which that possible trauma derived is not the same thing as a trauma that exists and lives with a person and that they experience according to them and their own socially situated circumstance, their culture, their identity, the degree to which it's affected them, the degree to which they conceptualize healing. And so I believe that having that data as a system, you know, if we say that ACEs are not deterministic, but we hold on to that number, there's an internal conflict in that idea.
Mhm.
If you can't get away from being identified by that ACE score, no matter how much healing you've done, no matter how much resilience you have, then that internal conflict is something we really need to attend to and be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
So my answer is no.
Thank you.
Well,
We
we're
won't-
coming up on an hour, and I could keep listening, Alex, if I had more time. I kept forgetting I was a podcast host. I was just
I know,
so
I did too.
interested in what you were
Because it made me so comfortable.
saying. So I think is there any last thought that you would throw out there before I hit stop here?
Yeah, what I want people to leave with is not a sense that there's nothing that we can do. If we
Yeah.
don't use ACEs, that there's nothing that we can do. We do have a lot of questions still about how we address students and families that are struggling, but some of the answers are not modern answers. They're the ones that we know.
Mm.
It is always a good idea to approach people with positive regard and kindness and belief in who they are, you know, and to care deeply about the lives that they live and what they need from us and how we as a school can provide opportunities for them. That's always good practice, and we don't need to know and apply quantitative data to everything in students' lives in order to do that work. In fact, that might be an opposition to showing care and humanity. That reduction to a number, when we're talking about people's complex experiences, might ultimately be dehumanizing. And so the goal is to not to step away from humanity, but to step into humanity and to reject dehumanizing practices that can cause systemic harm. And I would argue that collecting ACE data is one of those practices.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. I love it when we talk about humanity on the show. Care
All the
and
time.
humanity, yes, an
Care and
ongoing
humanity.
theme. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank you.
the article and the conversation, and whatever links you want to send me, I'll put in here, because
Absolutely.
I think this is going to spark some real curiosity in folks who are
It
listening or
usually
watching.
it usually does, and I
Yeah.
think that that's a good thing. It's okay for us to engage in discussion and have dissensus and, ultimately come into, best practices and work together. I
Mhm.
appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
And
happy to
thank
share
you.
resources or talk to anyone.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Do you want to share any contact? Do you have a website? Do you have?
I should have a
No,
website.
that's okay. I just wanted, I thought, oh, it didn't occur to me to
Yeah.
ask that. So if you do,
Yeah,
we'd plug it here, but
folks can certainly reach out to me through winninghoff@gmail.com. And that would probably be the best way to find me. You
uh-huh.
can find me on academia and ResearchGate and LinkedIn as
Uh-huh.
well.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh, go ahead.
I'm working on I'm getting ready to complete my dissertation work on this to
Uh-huh.
publish, and so I'll be happy to share research that I've done along the way as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to direct people once more to Bank Street. So it's Bank Street Occasional Paper Series. They have a lot of really great open access scholarly articles. And like, as you said, this is part of an issue about,
Yeah,
this is one article in an issue about trauma and ACE scores. So.
I also could plug my workshop that I'm giving in October at Lewis
Sure.
and Clark College. And this is kind of a drop at the end, but it's on the eugenics of ACEs,
Oh,
where I draw parallels between the
Liz and I are
history.
there.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'll draw parallels that I've done in my
Uh-huh.
work between the continuities between
Yeah.
historic public health movements, the use of signifiers that are broad and interpretable and shifting, and how those have been weaponized
Hmm.
in the US and beyond.
Yeah. That's pretty powerful. That I think so. Thank you for sharing that. Thanks, Liz, for being here.
Yeah, thank you both.
And for joining in. And thanks everybody for listening to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd.